The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And now that their majesties have left the National Capital Region, we can really pick apart the throne speech that the government wrote yesterday. Yesterday, Canadians heard a throne speech that was not bad on slogans and rhetoric, but terrible on any kind of detail and a plan. And a lot of times, government members will defend that by saying, well, you know, the details come out in the legislation. And while there may be some truth to that, usually in a throne speech, you at least get a clear indication of what that legislation will do. In other words, the way that the government is going to accomplish the goals that they have set out for themselves. But we got precisely none of that yesterday. We were told the government wants to build more homes, and yet all they did was talk about increasing the number of bureaucrats that run programs in Ottawa, and nothing to incentivize municipalities to speed up development speed up development processes and lower development charges. They copied and pasted, some might call it plagiarism, which is something that the Prime Minister has some familiarity with, many aspects of the Conservative platform, one of which specifically was eliminating the GST on new home construction. They must have dropped something when they were cutting and pasting that from the Conservative platform, because they accidentally restricted that. I say accidentally sarcastically. What they did with this policy is they made it much more narrower in its application. So our plan would have reduced the GST on new homes, period. They have restricted that to only some new home purchases. They've done nothing to talk, they did not talk at all about the way that they were going to reduce that red tape and lower those taxes. We have a Prime Minister who wrote a book. He wrote a book called Values, where he defined himself as a human being. And in that book, not only did he profess his love for the carbon tax, but he bragged about the experience he has imposing higher costs on not just Canadians, but on the people of the world. See, that's where this Prime Minister comes from. He comes from a global investment scheme where fancy bankers and powerful elites put together a grift. And the Prime Minister actually himself explained how he benefited from this. You see, he gave an interview where on this panel, he described how this grift unfolds. First, people like him, and he actually says this, he said he has access to important decision makers and policymakers around the world. He uses that access to lobby for regulatory changes. So in other words, he gets to have a glass of wine or a canopy with a government official in a country, and in those conversations or in those meetings, he convinces them to make regulatory changes, and then he goes out and invests in the companies that benefit from those changes. And the example he used, he spoke about lobbying the government of the United Kingdom to bring in a new requirement for jet fuel. That new requirement, there was no market for it. If there was a natural market for it, then aviation companies would make those changes to jet fuel. He specifically required a certain percentage of that aviation fuel had to be sourced from non-conventional energy. If there was a market for that, if that non-conventional product was more efficient, if it was cheaper, then the companies would do it themselves. They wouldn't need a regulatory agency to tell them to do it. So there's no market for it. Why? Because it will increase costs. Those costs get passed on to consumers, and fewer people would be able to afford to fly. So he convinces the policymaker to bring in a rule that cannot be ignored. In the absence of a market demanding it or necessitating it, the power of the government, the awesome power of the government, comes in and forces aviation companies to blend in a certain percentage of non-conventional energy to use in their fuel. Those extra costs get passed on to passengers. Fewer people are able to afford those tickets. So he convinces that policymaker that every plane flying in and out of a UK airport has to have a certain percentage of fuel. And then he looks around and he sees a company that's not making any money before the regulatory change, but now that there's a huge market for what they produce, this company that produces that non-conventional energy product, now all of a sudden it'll have a massive market. It'll be able to sell what it makes to all kinds of airlines flying in and out of the United Kingdom. So what does he do? He invests in that company. So not only does he lobby for the regulatory change, but then he goes and invests in the company and makes millions. You don't have to take my word for it. The Prime Minister himself admitted this before he ran for the leader of the Liberal Party. Now imagine doing that with any other aspect of government. Imagine your buddy owns some kind of an asphalt company, and because of one reason or another wasn't making much money, maybe selling an additive for the asphalt. There wasn't really a market for it. Cities and rural municipalities didn't think they needed to buy it, didn't really produce anything of value for motorists or taxpayers in that area. And imagine you use special access to get time with ministers or with government officials, and you convince them, not because there was a market for it, you convince them to pass a rule that your friend's company's product had to be included in all the asphalt that's being laid down in an area. And then you went out and you invested in that company. If you were an elected official and you did that, you would likely be up on criminal charges. You would likely be investigated for corruption. But that's exactly what the Prime Minister did in his private sector career. He used his access with government officials to lobby for changes to allow him to make investments and make millions. That is who this Prime Minister is. In that throne speech, no mention about how to get big projects built. Remember, it was the Liberal government that canceled big energy projects like Northern Gateway and Energy East. Northern Gateway would have opened up Asian markets. It's the shortest route between where the oil and gas is found in the ground and where there is a deep water port to be able to ship it to countries like India, China, Japan, countries with booming populations and an ever-increasing middle class. That are many of those countries right now buying their oil and gas, their energy, from countries who do not share our values. Countries with dictators, with regimes that abuse the rights of women, that abuse the rights of religious minorities, that engage in fomenting wars and terrorist activities, not just throughout the region, but throughout the world. Canadians are no longer able to fill those markets because Liberals canceled those pipelines. Nothing in the throne speech about repealing those terrible pieces of legislation or supporting those projects. He says he's the man with the plan. Slogans aren't as efficient as plans, yet there is no plan. And then he goes around and tells Canadians that there will not even be a budget for 6 months. I mean, look at all the economic calamities that Canadians have had to suffer through. An inflation crisis, cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, massive debt and deficits racked up by Liberal governments. The government now spending more, the Liberal government spending more on servicing the debt, in other words, paying the interest payments to bankers and bondholders than they are on health care. After all of this, and the Prime Minister himself saying speed was of the essence. We had to start, as a country, we had to start addressing this as quickly as possible. He's telling Canadians that we're going to have to wait for 6 months before we get this plan. I don't know of a single boardroom around the country that would keep a CEO in his position. If in the middle of a crisis, the CEO came in and said, I know we're in a crisis and don't worry, I've got a plan, I'll come back to you in 6 months. I don't think any board of directors would keep a CEO that asks for 6 months worth of grace period to start to address a problem. He says he wants to build, but he refuses to repeal the very laws that stop us from building. He will not commit to repealing C-69. That's the anti-pipeline bill, the No More Pipelines bill. He refuses to repeal the shipping ban that blocks Western Canadian oil from reaching global markets. That was Bill C-48. He's keeping in the energy cap, the production cap. He's keeping in the industrial carbon tax. The industrial carbon tax. I mean, here we have a situation where our steel workers, our aluminum workers, our manufacturers in Canada have to worry about their companies competing against American manufacturers when there is no carbon tax on the US side of the border. My colleague from Windsor-Tecumseh had a great point yesterday when she pointed out that saying you're going into fight with the Americans while keeping an industrial carbon tax on Canadian workers is like tying one elbow behind your back. It's not going to put Canada in a position of strength if the government keeps that industrial carbon tax. The Prime Minister flippantly said, when was the last time you bought a whole bunch of steel? Does he not realize that there's a lot of steel and a lot of things that Canadians buy on a pretty regular basis? Last time I opened up my fridge had steel. The car you drive has steel. Lots of household components have steel. Lots of framing material for new homes require steel. There are many, many things that Canadians have to buy on a regular basis that contain steel. That steel could be made in Canada, and we could export some of that steel into the US and around the world if Canadian manufacturers had an advantage, if they didn't have to pay that carbon tax. The irrational devotion to the carbon tax that the Prime Minister has in keeping the industrial side of it is a direct repudiation of anything he has said on helping Canada fight back from a position of strength. He's going to saddle us down with higher taxes and higher regulatory regimes. There's no mention of repealing the soft-on-crime laws C-75 and C-5, which unleashed a wave of crime across the country. Those two bills drastically lowered penalties for dangerous and repeat offenders. That is what caused the crime wave. You know, crime isn't just like the weather. You know, it's not like one day there might be a bit of humidity, the next day there might be a few extra car thefts. Crime is a direct result of justice policies. And when this government came in, when this Liberal Party came in, and they started repealing mandatory minimum sentences, and they started forcing judges to grant bail instead of jail for some of the country's most notorious and dangerous offenders, that is when we saw a direct correlation in the rise in crime. The same thing with the drug crisis. We had a government that decided to take taxpayers' money. Think of a taxpayer working so hard, picking up extra shifts, working long, long hours, missing out on time with their children and their families because they were hustling and striving and trying to eke out a better quality of life, knowing that when those tax dollars come straight off their paycheck, that a portion of that tax dollars was going to buy dangerous opioids to give out to drug dealers, to people to use in communities, and that those drugs ended up in the hands of drug dealers. Imagine the insult to injury that those Canadians who are barely getting by when they find out that their tax dollars went to subsidize drug distribution in our communities. This is simply the same old talking points dressed up in new packaging. The Liberals are trying to pull off a massive trick on Canadians. They're trying to pretend that if you just change your rhetoric a little bit and you change the leader and the name, but you keep the same ministers and you keep the same policies, that somehow Canadians will believe that things are actually different. See, changing superficial things is actually easy. You know, you can swap out the talking points. You can suddenly mimic some of the language that you hear from other political parties, as the Liberals did when they lifted conservative ideas. It's easy to wear black shoes and normal socks and pretend like everything's going to be different. But the things that actually affect Canadians' lives, they're not the superficial things. They're not the words on pieces of paper. They're not the grand prose that comes out of a monarch's visit to the Senate to read a throne speech. Canadians' lives are changed by the laws, the tax rates, and the regulations that governments set. And so far, we have absolutely zero indication that there will be anything meaningfully change under this Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, there was absolutely nothing in the throne speech to talk about unleashing our businesses and our resources. But that's what Conservatives will do. The best way to fight back against a threat against our country is to fight back from a position of strength. C'est facile d'utiliser les bonnes paroles.
It's easy to make lofty speeches and say all the right things. But at the end of the day, what matters is that we can only improve Canadians' quality of life by legislating. Speeches won't improve things for Canadians. Legislation will. Ministerial bills and decisions made by ministers. That's how we can really improve quality of life for Canadians. But as it stands, we've had no indication that this government will deliver real change for Canadians.
To the Canadian people during the last election will be what we fight for in this Parliament. Building on the success our leader Pierre Poilievre had in achieving 42% of the vote. Millions of new Canadians voting for the Conservative Party. I know my Conservative colleagues will agree with me on this. I guarantee you, every single one of us, when we were knocking doors in the last election, met people who told us, that they had never voted Conservative before.
Yes.
Many of whom said they never even voted before.
Yeah.
But they saw in our leader, Pierre Poilievre's vision for this country, something that they hadn't seen for a generation from the Liberals. Hope. Hope that that promise of Canada could be restored, where hard work pays off, where you can earn a powerful paycheck that affords not just the basic necessities of life, but some of the nice extras as well, too. The belief that every generation that comes after will be better off than the previous because our country continues to grow and improve upon itself. That hope has been lost over the past 10 years because of Liberal government policies. And while we have more work to do as the Conservative Party to win the next election, I can assure you that our leader, Pierre Poilievre, will continue to espouse that vision of hope, that promise to Canadians that life will get better. And in the meantime, we will hold this government to vigorous account. It is our job to go through, line by line, every dollar spent, every tax dollar taken out of the pocket of Canadians, every infringement on their liberty. Any decision that comes from this government, we will do our job. Not for ourselves, not because we're the blue team and they're the red team, but for Canadians, for the Canadians that have to go to work every day and shoulder that government spending and pay off that government debt and put up with the terrible outcomes of disastrous policies that have hurt our country for so long. More and more Canadians want a government that puts Canadian workers, Canadian energy, and Canadian families first. And that's what the Conservative opposition will be fighting for every single day for as long as this Parliament lasts, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'll close with this thought. It was very disappointing for not just parliamentarians, but for Canadians themselves. There are a lot of economic headwinds that aren't just on the horizon. They are absolutely blowing through communities all across this country. TD Bank is predicting a recession just around the corner with thousands of jobs lost. We heard from our housing shadow minister today about a phenomenon that only the Liberal Party of Canada could possibly create, where prices are still so high that new buyers can't afford to buy them, but they're now lower than the inflated prices that the existing owners bought them at. So you have a situation where sellers can't afford to sell because if they drop their prices anymore, they won't be able to cover the mortgage that they owe, but it's still far too high for buyers. Buyers can't buy, sellers can't sell. Only a Liberal government could achieve such monumental failure. Yep. We have a situation where the debt required to finance what the government has campaigned on will put enormous pressure on bond markets. We don't know where that will lead, but it's never, ever led to a good place when governments start borrowing so much money that lenders start to doubt if the government will ever be able to fully pay it off and start demanding a higher and higher premium for that. So you would think that the man with the plan, the guy you hire in a crisis, the guy that claims that he can walk into a boardroom and solve these issues and he can go down. He still hasn't gotten results from his visit to the United States. Other countries have gotten deals. This Prime Minister hasn't got one. Still no plan to get new energy projects built. And worst of all, no budget to show Canadians just how bad the situation is and what they might be facing in the future. That lack of a budget is probably the most concerning thing that we've heard from the government over the last few weeks. I mean, this is the number one job. The reason why the House of Commons exists is to approve taxation and spending. That is the origin story of our parliamentary system. And it's not just a matter of disrespect, it's a matter of hiding from Canadians the true consequences of government policies. And the fact that the government will not commit to tabling a budget before they go on vacation for the summer is telling. What it's telling me is that they're really afraid to share the bad news. They're afraid of coming clean with Canadians because the numbers are so bad. But Mr. Speaker, the best thing you can do with tough medicine is take it early, and then all of us can get together with trying to fix the problem. So we urge the government to table that budget. And it's in that light that I move the following. That the motion, I move, seconded by l'honorable député de Bégantic-Lac-d'Érable. Lobinière. That the motion be amended by adding the following. And we urge your Majesty's advisors to include a firm commitment to present to Parliament an economic update or budget this spring before the House adjourns for the summer that incorporates measures aimed at unleashing Canada's economic potential, including full accountability of Canada's finances.